The sky churned with the last embers of daylight, streaked in bruised purples and burnt oranges. A bitter wind whispered through the prairie, rattling the brittle grass as Eliza Walker stood outside the small homestead she had once called home. The weight of loss pressed against her chest, though she refused to let it show, not in front of them, not in front of the men who had just condemned her and her children to death. Jed Walker leaned against the porch railing, his tobacco-stained teeth gleaming as he smirked. "Ain't no place for a woman alone out here," he said, spitting onto the dry earth. "But that ain't my problem no more." Eliza gripped her shawl tighter around her shoulders, though it did little to ward off the chill creeping into her bones. "Jed, please, for the children's sake." Her voice held steady, but there was a tremor just beneath the surface. Behind her, Daniel stood stiff as a fence post, his small hands balled into fists. At 10 years old, he was old enough to understand the cruelty of the moment, though not yet wise enough to hide his anger. Sarah clung to her mother's skirts, her 6-year-old frame trembling like a leaf caught in a storm. Jed's smirk faltered. He glanced at the men beside him, his brother Ephraim and cousin Luke, their expressions set in the same cold indifference. His gaze shifted back to Eliza. "You ain't our kin, Eliza. You were married, my brother, and now he's dead." His voice turned hard. "That means you ain't got no claim here. The land goes to us like it should have in the first place." Eliza sucked in a breath. "John wanted us to stay. He built this land for his family. For his blood," Jed corrected. "And you ain't blood." Her fingers tightened around the frayed edges of her shawl, but she kept her chin high. There was no use arguing. The decision had been made long before she'd stepped into the yard. She had seen in their eyes the moment she returned from burying her husband, the way they sized her up, not as family, but as an obstacle. Behind her, Daniel took a step forward. "Pa wouldn't want this," he said, his voice cracking but defiant. Jed barked out a laugh. "Boy, what your pa wanted don't matter. He's in the ground." His gaze darkened, and when he spoke again, his voice was a low, dangerous thing. "You'd best learn that fast if you want to survive." A sharp gust of wind howled through the valley, lifting the dust around them. Ephraim adjusted the rifle slung over his shoulder. "Ain't no more talk needed. Take what you can carry and be gone by sundown." Eliza swallowed the knot forming in her throat. Pride was a useless thing in the face of survival. Begging wouldn't change their minds, and she would not humiliate herself before these men. Without a word, she turned, taking Daniel's hand in one and scooping Sarah into her arms. The cabin door swung shut behind her with a hollow finality. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and the fading remnants of home. The quilt she had stitched during her first winter here still lay folded on the cot. The table still bore the imprint of John's hands. Everything familiar, everything she had fought to build, was now just a place she no longer belonged. Daniel helped gather what little they could: a threadbare blanket, a tin cup, a small knife that had belonged to John. Sarah sat on the floor, silent except for the occasional sniffle. She did not yet understand the depth of what was happening, but she felt it. Children always did. Eliza pressed a stale biscuit into Daniel's palm. "Eat," she whispered, but he shook his head. "I ain't hungry." She didn't argue. They both knew he was lying. The last rays of sun bled into the horizon as they stepped outside. The men hadn't moved. Luke tossed her a bundle wrapped in cloth. It landed at her feet with a thud. "There's some dried beans in there. A little flour." His voice carried something that almost sounded like pity. Jed shot him a glare, then turned back to Eliza. "Keep walking west," he said. "Might be a town a few days out, if you last that long." Eliza held his gaze, burning the sight of him into her mind. There had been a time when John had trusted this man, had laughed with him over the dinner table. How foolish they had been. She didn't reply, didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her beg. Lifting Sarah onto her hip, she took Daniel's hand and walked away. The prairie stretched before them, endless and indifferent. The wind carried the sound of the homestead behind them, the faint laughter of men who had already forgotten them. They walked until the cabin was no longer in sight, until only the open land remained. Sarah whimpered against her shoulder. "Mama, where are we going?" Eliza kissed her forehead. tasting the salt of her daughter's tears. "Someplace safe, sweetheart." She prayed she wasn't lying. The first night fell swiftly, dragging the cold behind it. They found shelter beneath a crooked old tree, its roots clawing the earth like desperate hands. Eliza wrapped her children in the blanket, pulling them close. Daniel sat up, his breath curling into night air. "We should have fought them," he muttered. Eliza stroked his hair, smoothing back the wild curls that reminded her so much of John. "Fighting wouldn't have changed their minds," she said softly. He turned his face away, but she saw the way his jaw clenched, the war raging inside him. The night stretched long and merciless. Coyotes howled in the distance, their calls threading through the darkness. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying a chill that sank deep into their bones. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted once. Then again, Eliza lay awake long after the children had drifted into uneasy sleep. Her body ached with exhaustion, but her mind remained sharp, alert. She was no fool. She knew what dangers lurked in the wilderness: wolves, bandits, starvation, and worse. A rustle in the grass sent her heart hammering. She tightened her grip on the knife beneath her blanket, every muscle tensed. Silence. Then a sound, soft but deliberate. Footsteps. Her breath caught. The darkness stretched before her, thick and impenetrable, but she felt it, a presence just beyond her vision. She held her children closer, her fingers tightening around the hilt of the knife. For the first time since she'd been cast out, true fear settled into her bones. She was not alone. The wind had shifted. Eliza felt it before she opened her eyes, the subtle change in the air, the way it carried a scent unfamiliar to her. The faint musk of damp earth crushed grass, something alive and watching. She lay still, listening. The night had been cruel, the cold gnawing at her bones, but morning had arrived without mercy. Sarah stirred in her arms, her little body curling closer, seeking warmth that Eliza did not have to give. Daniel sat upright beside them, his back stiff, eyes scanning the open land. He had not slept much. Neither had she. The prairie stretched endlessly in every direction, barren except for the occasional gnarled tree or patch of shrubs. The land was beautiful in its wildness, but today it felt like an enemy. There was no shelter, no promise of food, only distance. Daniel's voice was hoarse. "We gotta find water." Eliza pushed herself up, wincing as her muscles protested. The blanket had done little to keep the cold out, and her body felt sluggish, as though the frost had crept into her veins overnight. Sarah whimpered, rubbing her eyes. "Mama, I'm hungry." Eliza pressed a kiss to her temple, willing herself to be strong. "I know, sweetheart. We'll find something soon." It was a lie. Daniel met her gaze. He knew it too. They started walking. The morning sun was deceptive, offering light, but no warmth. Each step was a battle against exhaustion, the weight of their hunger slowing them down. The bundle of food they had taken from the homestead was already gone. A handful of flour, a few dried beans. They had stretched it as long as they could, but it had not been enough. Eliza's stomach ached, but she ignored it. She had long since accepted that she would go hungry before her children did. The land rolled on, featureless, the horizon an unbroken line. Each hour felt longer than the last. Sarah grew heavy in her arms, her small body drained of energy. Daniel trudged ahead, his steps dogged but determined. Eliza's mind drifted to John. What would he do? Where would he go? The ache of his absence was a living thing inside her, a wound that would never heal. But grief had no place here, only survival. A flicker of movement caught her eye. She halted, grabbing Daniel's arm. The grass shifted, a whisper of motion against the wind. A coyote, its skeletal frame slinked through the grass. Yellow eyes locked onto them. It was alone, but she knew better than to trust that. Where there was one, there were others. Daniel swallowed hard. "Mama?" "Slow," she murmured. The coyote crouched lower, muscles tensed. She tightened her grip on the knife tucked into her skirt. It was pitifully small, but it was all she had. The coyote inched forward, its ribs protruding beneath its ragged fur. Sarah whimpered. Then a sharp whistle cut through the air. The coyote froze. Eliza's breath hitched. The whistle came again, this time accompanied by the sound of hoofbeats. Steady, deliberate. The coyote flicked its ears, then turned sharply and disappeared into the grass. Eliza turned, her pulse roaring in her ears. A man on horseback emerged from the trees. He was unlike any man she had ever seen. The sunlight cast his features in sharp relief. High cheekbones, a strong jaw, dark eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. His hair was long, black as raven's wings, braided down his back. His body was lean but powerful, clad in buckskin. A knife strapped his hip, a bow slung across his shoulder. A Cheyenne warrior. Eliza's breath caught, fear lancing through her. She had heard the stories. Savages, they called them. Killers. The man's gaze swept over them, assessing, unreadable. Daniel moved closer to her, his fingers curling into the fabric of her skirt. The warrior did not speak. For a long moment, the world held still. Then, without a word, he reached into the pouch at his waist and tossed something toward them. It landed in the dust with a dull thud. Meat. Eliza's stomach clenched painfully at the sight of it. The warrior remained motionless, watching. Daniel looked up at her, his face tight with hunger, but he did not move. He was waiting for her permission. Eliza swallowed. She did not trust this man. She did not know why he was here, what he wanted, but she knew hunger. Slowly, she crouched and picked up the offering. It was dried, salted, probably deer. She tore a small piece and handed it to Daniel, then another to Sarah. Only when they had eaten did she allow herself a bite. The warrior studied her for a moment longer, then turned his horse and started away, heading toward the trees. Eliza exhaled, relief warring with confusion. But then he stopped. He turned back to them and gestured. Come. Eliza stiffened. Daniel looked up at her. He wants us to follow him, he said quietly. She knew. She also knew that she had no reason to trust him, but they would not survive much longer on their own. Eliza looked at her children, then back at the warrior. She took a breath, and she followed. The journey was silent. The warrior did not speak, and Eliza did not ask questions. She kept her children close, her mind alert. The land shifted as they traveled, the flat prairie giving way to wooded hills, the scent of pine and damp earth replacing the dry air. The wind no longer bit so cruelly. They reached a small clearing by a stream. A fire had been left smoldering, its embers still glowing faintly. A shelter of branches and animal hides stood nearby, simple but sturdy. The warrior dismounted, moving with quiet efficiency. He crouched by the fire, stirring it back to life. The flames flickered, casting shadows over his sharp features. Eliza hesitated at the edge of the clearing. You safe here? The words were slow, deliberate. His voice was low, steady. Eliza's grip on Sarah tightened. Why? The warrior met her gaze. You and children lost. A pause. Storm coming. Eliza glanced at the sky. The clouds had thickened, dark and heavy. He was right. Daniel looked between them. What's your name? The warrior was silent for a moment. Tall Fox. Daniel nodded. Eliza did not, but she did step forward. The fire was warm. Sarah curled into her lap, already half asleep. Daniel sat beside her, chewing on another strip of dried meat. Tall Fox remained across from them, watching but not intruding. Eliza did not trust him. But for the first time since she had been cast out, she did not feel alone. The fire had burned down to embers when Eliza stirred, the weight of exhaustion still pressing against her limbs. The shelter Tall Fox had given them, a crude lean-to of hides and branches, held off the worst of the wind, but the cold still seeped through the gaps, clinging to her skin like a second layer. She shifted, pulling Sarah closer, feeling the slow rise and fall of her daughter's breath against her chest. Daniel lay a few feet away, curled tightly beneath the blanket, but his eyes were open, fixed on the dying fire. He had barely slept, always on edge, always watching. His father had once told him that the land belonged to the strongest, that a man had to keep his wits about him if he meant to survive. John had meant it as a lesson, but Daniel had taken it as a law. Tall Fox sat just beyond the fire, sharpening a blade with slow, deliberate strokes. He had not spoken much the night before, had offered food, warmth, and little else. Eliza still did not know what to make of him. She did not understand why he had helped them, why he had not simply left them to their fate. He owed them nothing. And yet he was here. As if sensing her gaze, Tall Fox looked up. "We leave soon." Eliza stiffened. "Go where?" "West." The word sent a shiver through her, though not from fear. West meant mountains, meant distance from the men who had cast him out. It also meant the unknown. She pulled the blanket tighter around Sarah's small body. "We can't go back." Tall Fox held her gaze. "No, men follow." Eliza's pulse quickened. She had known it was a risk, had felt it in her bones the moment she had turned her back on the homestead. Jed was not the type to let things rest, not when he believed something belonged to him. Daniel sat up. "How do you know?" Tall Fox did not answer right away. He simply gestured toward the trees, toward a place where the brush had been disturbed. The grass bent low. "Tracks." Daniel swallowed hard. Eliza's breath came shallow. "How long?" "Day. Maybe less." She felt her stomach twist. Tall Fox stood, sliding the blade into the sheath at his waist. "We go now." Eliza did not argue. The journey began in silence, the weight of urgency settling over them. Tall Fox moved like a shadow, his steps soundless against the earth, his senses always reaching beyond what the eye could see. Eliza followed, Sarah still half asleep in her arms, her body light as a bundle of rags. Daniel walked beside her, his small hands clenched into fists, his jaw set. The land was changing. The prairie thinned, giving way to hills, to trees that stretched toward the sky like skeletal fingers. The wind carried the scent of damp earth and pine, a promise of the mountains that lay ahead. Eliza's legs ached. Hunger gnawed at her insides, but she did not slow. There was no room for weakness here. Hours passed. When they reached the river, the sound of rushing water filled the air, a deep, relentless roar that swallowed all other noise. The current was strong, the water dark and fast-moving. Tall Fox studied it for a long moment, then turned to Eliza. "Hold tight." She barely had time to react before he took Sarah from her arms, cradling the child against his chest with practiced ease. Eliza's stomach clenched, but she said nothing. She did not trust this man, but she had no choice. Daniel went first, gripping the rope Tall Fox had tied across the river. The water reached his waist, the force of it nearly pulling his small frame under, but he gritted his teeth and pushed forward. Eliza followed, her breath coming in sharp bursts as the cold bit into her skin. Her dress grew heavy, clinging to her legs, dragging her down with each step. Her fingers ached as they tightened around the rope, her arms screaming in protest. Halfway across, her foot slipped. The current seized her, yanking her downward with a force that stole the breath from her lungs. For one terrible moment, she was weightless, the world spinning, water closing over her head. Then a hand caught her wrist. Strong, unyielding. Tall Fox pulled her up, his grip steady, his eyes unreadable. Eliza gasped, coughing out water, her body trembling. But she was alive. By the time they reached the other side, she could barely stand. Tall Fox set Sarah down, watching as Eliza bent over, her hands on her knees, trying to catch her breath. "You fight too much," he said finally. She looked up at him, teeth chattering. "And you don't fight enough." For the first time, something like amusement flickered across his face. They did not linger. The land grew rougher, the trees thicker, shadows stretching long and dark. Every sound felt amplified, every movement a threat unseen. Tall Fox moved ahead, his posture tense. Daniel touched Eliza's sleeve, his voice barely a whisper. "Something's wrong." She felt it too. Then, a snap. Not a branch shifting under the weight of the wind. Not the natural groan of the forest settling into itself. A footstep. Eliza's breath caught. Tall Fox turned, eyes sharp. "Go," he murmured. Then he was gone, slipping into the trees like smoke. Eliza did not hesitate. She grabbed Daniel's hand, scooped Sarah into her arms, and ran. The forest blurred around them, branches clawing at her skin, the ground uneven beneath her feet. Daniel stumbled but kept moving, his breath ragged. Behind them, the sound of men's voices cut through the trees. Panic surged through Eliza. They had found them. She ran harder, her muscles screaming in protest. Ahead, the land dropped off, a rocky slope leading down into the valley. Too steep. She turned sharply, heart pounding. A gunshot cracked through the air. Eliza flinched, ducking low, shielding Sarah's small body with her own. Daniel gasped. She whipped around. Tall Fox emerged from the shadows, a blade glinting in his hand. A man stumbled forward, clutching his side, blood seeping through his shirt. Tall Fox did not stop moving. Another gunshot. Eliza dropped to the ground, pulling Daniel with her. She could hear the struggle, the sharp, desperate grunts, the dull thud of fists against flesh. Then silence. Eliza's breath came in short gasps. She dared not move. Tall Fox stepped into view, his face expressionless. Blood spattered his tunic, his knife dark with it. "They go back," he said. "More come." Eliza swallowed hard, gripping Daniel's trembling hand. Tall Fox sheathed his knife. Not safe here. She knew that already. The night was coming fast, shadows stretching long across the land. They had no choice now. They had to keep moving. Darkness swallowed the land as they moved, the trees stretching tall and black against the night sky. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine, the wind whispering secrets through the branches. Eliza kept Sarah close to her chest, feeling the slow, steady rise and fall of her breath. Daniel trudged beside her, his face pale, his hands clenched into tight fists. Tall Fox walked ahead, silent, his movements fluid as a shadow. The weight of what happened pressed against Eliza's ribs. The men had found them. They would come again. She knew it as surely as she knew the sky would not spare them from the storm that loomed on the horizon. Jed Walker was not the kind of man who let things slip through his fingers. He had sent men once. He would send more. Tall Fox stopped suddenly, his head tilting toward the darkness. Eliza halted, her pulse thudding against her skin. She did not hear anything, but she had learned to trust his instincts. The warrior did not waste words, and when he sensed something, it was real. Daniel exhaled sharply. "Is it them?" Tall Fox did not answer. Instead, he crouched low, pressing his hand against the earth. His eyes flickered to Eliza. Men close. Eliza's throat tightened. She glanced at Daniel, at Sarah's sleeping face. Running had bought them time, but not enough. She had no more strength left for running. Tall Fox stood, his body tense. "You stay." He motioned toward a thick outcrop of boulders nestled against the hillside. "I go." Eliza grabbed his arm before she could stop herself. "Alone." His gaze met hers. There was no fear in it, no doubt. "I know this land. I go." Daniel's voice was quiet but firm. "We should fight." Eliza's breath hitched. She turned to him, ready to tell him no, that he was just a child, but something in his eyes made her hesitate. He was still small, still young, but the boy who had left the homestead was not the same boy standing before her now. He had seen hunger, he had seen death, and he had survived. Tall Fox nodded once, approving. Not now, but soon. Eliza touched Daniel's face, her fingers brushing against the dirt smudged across his cheek. "Stay close to me." Tall Fox slipped into the night, vanishing into the trees as though he had never been there at all. Eliza pressed herself and the children against the boulders, the rock cool against her back. Her heart pounded, each beat a reminder that she was still alive. She strained to hear anything, footsteps, voices, the rustle of movement, but the night held its breath. Then a gunshot. The sound split the quiet like a jagged crack of thunder. Daniel flinched. Sarah jerked awake, her small fingers digging into Eliza's dress. "Mama." "Shoo!" Eliza tightened her grip on her daughter, pressing her against her chest. More gunfire. Then silence. Eliza's breath came fast, shallow. She did not know what had happened, if Tall Fox was still alive, if the men were still out there. Fear curled inside her, wrapping around her ribs like a fist. Then a voice. "Come out, Eliza." The blood in her veins turned cold. "Jed." She turned her head slowly. peering through the darkness. The outline of men stood beyond the trees, their shapes flickering in the moonlight. At the center, Jed Walker stood tall, his rifle resting against his shoulder. His face was hidden in shadow, but she could hear the smile in his voice. "Come on now. Don't make me come get you." Eliza's grip on the knife at her waist tightened. She could feel Daniel's breath beside her, fast and uneven. Jed took a step forward. "You got nowhere left to go." She closed her eyes for half a second, forcing herself to steady. She was not the same woman who had been cast out of that homestead. She had not broken. She had not died, and she would not die tonight. Slowly, she rose to her feet. She stepped from behind the boulder, the knife hidden in her skirt. The men saw her and hesitated, their fingers twitching over the triggers of their guns. Jed let out a small laugh. "You look like hell, Eliza." She did not flinch. "And you look like a man who can't stand the thought of a woman surviving without him." His smile faltered. He tilted his head, considering her. "You don't belong out here. You never did." Eliza met his gaze, holding it steady. "And yet, I'm still standing." A flicker of irritation crossed his face. "Enough of this. You're coming back." Eliza let out a slow breath. "No." Jed's expression darkened. "I wasn't asking." He lifted his rifle. Then, from the trees, a whistle cut through the night air. Jed hesitated, his head snapping toward the sound, and then chaos erupted. A figure moved through the darkness. Swift, deadly, tall fox. He struck first, his knife slicing through the nearest man's arm. A scream shattered the quiet. Gunfire followed. Eliza lunged. Before Jed could react, she was moving, her body faster than thought. The knife in her grip found its mark, slashing across his forearm. He let out a snarl, his gun dropping to the dirt. Pain twisted his features. "You..." Eliza didn't wait for him to finish. She grabbed the fallen rifle, lifting it with trembling hands. Jed took a step back. His eyes flickered with something almost like disbelief. "You wouldn't." She pulled the trigger. The shot echoed through the trees. Jed stumbled, his body jerking as the bullet tore through him. He collapsed to his knees, hand pressed against the wound in his chest. His breath came in ragged, uneven gasps. Eliza stood over him, the rifle still raised. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Jed's lips parted, his voice barely a whisper. "You..." She pulled the trigger again. This time, he didn't get back up. The forest was silent. The other men were gone, fled or dead. She did not know. Tall Fox stood a few feet away, his knife glinting in the moonlight, his breath steady despite the battle that had just unfolded. Eliza exhaled, the weight of everything crashing over her all at once. The rifle slipped from her hands, landing in the dirt with a soft thud. Her knees buckled. Daniel was there before she could fall, his small hand steadying her. "Mama," he whispered. She wrapped her arms around him, pulling Sarah close. Tall Fox approached, his gaze unreadable. "You are strong," he said. Eliza looked at the body in the dirt, looked at the blood on her hands. She did not feel strong. She felt alive. The night stretched around them, vast and quiet. The past lay behind her, unmoving, unchangeable. Ahead, the land stretched wide and untamed. The frontier had taken everything from her. And yet, here she was. She lifted her chin, the weight of fear falling from her shoulders like a discarded shroud. "We should go," she said. Tall Fox nodded. Without another word, they turned toward the horizon, toward whatever lay beyond the darkness. And Eliza did not look back.